Good afternoon. This is Larry Hatcher, and we are in Psych 100 General Psychology. And today it's going to be Chapter 6, Module 1, Learning and Behavior. Today I'm going to lecture on classical conditioning, also known as Pavlovian conditioning, and get you ready for a small group discussion exercise and eventually for a written test dealing with classical conditioning. If you have not already done so, make sure you have the lecture notes in front of you that you'll need. We're in Chapter 6. This is Module 1, Learning and Behavior. Pull up your lecture notes. Your notes are blanked out as I go through my lecture. I will fill in the blanks so you have a complete set of notes by the end. Page 1 begins with an outline of the module in general, but let's instead scroll down to what I'm actually going to lecture on today. Today it's going to be classical conditioning. Outline for my lecture on classical conditioning, Pavlovian conditioning. Start with a definition, just what is learning, and specifically what is associative learning, and then get into the bulk of the lecture, most of which I will spend talking about the components of classical conditioning. What is an unconditioned response? What is an unconditioned stimulus? And so forth. So I am on page 2 of our blanked out lecture notes, and we come to our first fill in the blank. Just what is learning? Definition for learning: relatively enduring change in a potential behavior that results from experience. In psychology, we try to divide up the causes of behavior. One of the big questions that we're often interested in is, why do people behave the way they do? And there's more than one answer to that question because there's more than one cause of behavior, but we know that an important cause of behavior is learning. The experiences that we go through influence the ways that we're going to behave in the future. There are different kinds of learning. This chapter begins by talking about associative learning, and that's what most of my lecturing is going to be about. Associative learning involves making a connection between two events, or making a connection between a response and the consequences of that response. When you think of associative learning, think of the kind of learning that you see not only in human beings, but also in a lot of non-human animals. Dogs are very good at associative learning. Cats are good at associative learning. Rats are good at associative learning. That's why they've been used as subjects in so much of the research that you'll read about in Ettinger's chapter on learning. Most of my lecture will focus on associative learning. Associative learning involves classical conditioning, what Ettinger calls Pavlovian conditioning, and operant conditioning. By the end of this chapter, I will have lectured on both classical and operant, but I like to begin by making a distinction between the two. Here's one difference between classical versus operant conditioning. With classical conditioning, the response being conditioned is often an emotional response. Think of classical conditioning as involving responses that occur, initially at least, more or less automatically. With classical conditioning, the response is sometimes as automatic as a reflex. It can be as automatic as an emotional reaction to some situation. That is what you should think of when you first think of classical conditioning. In contrast, operant conditioning, the response is often a behavior. With operant conditioning, the response is often a behavioral response. You want to teach your dog to sit whenever you say sit. You'll probably use operant conditioning to achieve that. You want your child to clean up his room whenever it's a mess. You'll want to use operant conditioning to change that. Operant conditioning focuses on behavior. If we were teaching in the classroom, I would normally begin with a video that does a good job of introducing classical conditioning. The video is called Video Classical Conditioning Marines. I like to show it because it's a good introduction to classical conditioning, illustrates some of the things that we will discuss as we go through the different components of classical conditioning. I don't want to show it in this video because I could find myself in violation of copyright rules, and so I'm going to skip this video. I'm not going to require that you watch it on your own. I will scrub from your upcoming multiple choice quiz any questions dealing with the video. Let's instead scroll down to something that is not copyrighted. This is the video link that would take you to the video that we're not going to watch. Let's scroll down to something that I can talk about. Question. Oh, well, that was the question from the video, wasn't it? Yeah, skip. That was my question, my answer to the question. We're not going to do that. Instead, let's talk about small group discussion exercise that we're going to eventually do in this class. And needless to say, you won't be doing it during this class meeting because you're watching this online. But when we get to back together as a class, I intend to have the class do a small group discussion exercise dealing with classical conditioning, and the discussion exercise is first presented at the top of page 5. I'm just going to read it over now so that it's in your mind and you know what to look for as I go through my lecture. As I go through my lecture, I'll give you the info that you need to do this discussion exercise, and you'll find that a version of this discussion exercise is going to appear as a written test in after a later class meeting. It won't be after you watch this video, it'll be after we get back together as a class. You do the small group discussion exercise, and I give you some feedback on the small group discussion exercise. It goes like this. Think about some situation in which classical conditioning, Pavlovian conditioning took place. You can make up a new example if you like. You can use an example from class or from the Ettinger book. You must complete both of the following tasks in answering this question. Task 1. On this page, I've provided part of a before conditioning figure and an after conditioning figure. You must fill in both figures with the following information. Just below each oval, and you can see that my figure includes ovals, just below each oval, label the oval as either the US, the UR, the CS, or the CR, as we did in class. In other words, write US just below the oval that represents unconditioned stimulus, write UR just below the one that represents unconditioned response, and so forth. Inside each oval, provide the name of the unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, conditioned response that's relevant to your specific example. For example, if the US from your example was food, then write the word food inside the appropriate oval. Perhaps inside this oval if it's the right one. That's task 1, filling in the ovals, labeling the ovals. Then task 2, on the page that follows this page, briefly describe this situation in which classical conditioning took place. Give me just enough details so that I understand the figures that you drew on this page. Now, the ovals look like so. Before conditioning, ovals look like this. After conditioning, ovals look like this. This should not make any sense to you right now, but hopefully it will make sense by the time we're through this lecture. And when we get back together in person, you'll be ready to do a small group discussion exercise like this. Let's scroll down. Where are we? Page 7. Top of page 7 looks like this. End of the discussion exercise preview, resume lecture. I am on page 7 now. Some clarifications. Ettinger uses a different term than I do for my first research topic or my first lecture topic. What I call classical conditioning is what Ettinger calls Pavlovian conditioning. Different names for the same concept. In a minute, you'll see why they call it Pavlovian conditioning, which in fact is a good name for this kind of learning. Let's begin where I usually like to begin, with a definition. Classical conditioning defined. It is a type of learning in which a response naturally elicited by one stimulus comes to be elicited by a different, previously neutral stimulus. Type of learning, which a response naturally elicited by one stimulus comes to be elicited by a different previously neutral stimulus. That definition should not make any sense right now, but it will make sense soon. On page 8, let's begin with an example of classical conditioning. This is an example of classical conditioning that came from my own personal life. When I was an undergraduate, one of the universities I attended was Marshall University in West Virginia. My last year, I needed money, so I volunteered to be a resident advisor in one of the residence halls on that campus. They assigned me to something that at the time was called South Hall. It was at the time probably the worst dorm on campus. It had been built like 80 years before. The electrical system was lousy, the plumbing was lousy, and in fact, the plumbing plays a role in my first example of classical conditioning. I moved into the dorm. First day that I was there, I decided to take a shower. And I had these big communal shower rooms where theoretically 10 different people could be showering at the same time. Anyhow, I'm in there. I turn on the shower water, turn on the hot water and the cold water, and I get it to a comfortable warm temperature. And I'm standing there under the comfortable warm water, kind of spacing it out, not paying much attention. Somebody walks into the toilet, uses the toilet, and flushes the toilet. I hear the sound of a toilet flush, and 2 seconds after I hear the sound of a toilet flush, I'm suddenly being scalded by hot water. It's no longer comfortable warm water, it's hot water coming out. The hot water causes a fear reaction on my part. I jump out of the way, and I'm kind of shook up for a few seconds because I've been scalded by hot water. Hot water elicited a fear reaction. So that was day 1. Day 2, I'm taking a shower. Turn on the hot water and the cold water, get the water to a comfortable temperature. I'm standing there under the comfortable water, not paying much attention. Somebody comes in, uses the bathroom. I hear the sound of a toilet flush, and 2 seconds later, I'm suddenly being scalded by hot water. Once again, the hot water causes a fear reaction. This goes on for 2 or 3 days. Eventually, not being completely stupid, eventually I caught on, well, gee, it seems like every time I hear a toilet flush, the next thing I know, I'm being scalded by hot water. Now, the moment that I made that connection, the moment that light bulb lit up above my head, I had been classically conditioned. I had come to understand that one stimulus, sound of a toilet flush, is immediately followed by another stimulus, scalding hot water that scares me. Let's see how we might illustrate my experience in a figure. This is a figure kind of similar to the figure that I showed you in the discussion exercise earlier. Similar but not identical. We're going to start here, and then in a minute we're going to change this figure so that it uses the terminology of classical conditioning. The red square in the upper part of the figure is labeled before conditioning. These are the events that took place before conditioning was complete, before I understood what was going on in that dorm. I'm taking a shower. I hear the sound of a toilet flush. Notice I've labeled this neutral stimulus. That's because the toilet flush at the beginning doesn't have any effect on me. It doesn't cause me to be afraid, doesn't cause me to be happy, it doesn't have any effect on me. It's just the sound of a toilet flush. But 3 seconds after the sound of a toilet flush, I'm being scalded by hot water, and the hot water automatically causes a fear reaction. Human beings are wired so that if something happens that causes you pain, it immediately causes a fear reaction. You'd get this kind of reaction in a newborn baby that had not learned anything. You scald them with hot water, they'll experience a fear reaction. So day 1, I hear a flush, hot water causes fear. As of day 1, I'm not conditioned. But the next day, it happens again. I'm taking a shower, everything's comfortable. I hear the sound of a toilet flush. 3 seconds later, I'm being scalded by hot water. Hot water causes a fear reaction. This goes on for 2 or 3 days, and eventually my brain makes the connection. Gee, it seems like every time I hear a toilet flush, the next thing I know, I'm being scalded by hot water. When my brain makes that connection, when it understands toilet flush is followed by hot water, I no longer need to be scalded by hot water. The toilet flush alone will be enough to bring about a fear reaction, and that fear reaction will motivate me to do something, get away from the hot water. Once I've made that connection, we can say that I am classically conditioned. After conditioning is successful, I no longer need to be scalded. From that day forward, as soon as I heard the sound of a toilet flush, it would cause a fear reaction, and the fear reaction would motivate me to do something, to get away from the hot water. A week later, if I heard the sound of a toilet flush, sound of a toilet flush would cause a fear reaction. Fear reaction motivates me to go away. I am classically conditioned. Let's relate the above figure to my definition of classical conditioning I gave you a minute ago. I said classical conditioning is a type of learning in which a response naturally elicited by one stimulus comes to be elicited by a different, previously neutral stimulus. What does that have to do with my figure? Type of learning in which a response naturally is elicited by one stimulus. A fear response is naturally elicited by hot water. That's why I call this natural stimulus, why I call that natural response. Type of learning which response naturally elicited by one stimulus comes to be elicited by a different previously neutral stimulus. The previously neutral stimulus was the sound of the toilet flush. Initially it was neutral, didn't cause fear reaction, but once conditioning was complete, it was no longer neutral. Now, sound of a toilet flush causes a fear reaction. Now that's classical conditioning, but I haven't used the terminology of classical conditioning yet. Let's take that same event and describe the same event using the terminology of classical conditioning, the kind of terminology that you're going to need to be able to use in your small group discussion exercise and eventually in your written test. Following figure is identical to the figure that I showed you above, except now I have different names for the stimuli and responses. If you're not accustomed to using words like stimulus, response all the time, stimuli is plural for stimulus. Stimulus is an event, something that happens, like the sound of a toilet flush is a stimuli. Think of it typically as an event in the environment. Let's take the same figure and change the labels on the ovals. This is the same scenario. I have the same stimuli and responses inside the ovals, but I've changed the labels for the ovals. My flush is now labeled conditioned stimulus. The hot water I've now labeled unconditioned stimulus. Fear I've labeled unconditioned response. And then after conditioning is complete, the flush I now call a conditioned stimulus. The fear I now call a conditioned response. I have those labels. Let's define the terms that constitute those labels. General heading is, let me see, where am I? I'm on page 11. General heading is classical conditioning, stimuli, and responses. In that most recent figure that I showed you, I labeled one of the ovals unconditioned response, which we will abbreviate UR. Definition for unconditioned response: response that automatically occurs whenever the unconditioned stimulus, that is the US, is presented and no training is necessary. This is the important part. No training is necessary. Unconditioned response is something that human beings display automatically because they're programmed to display this automatically. Unconditioned response is something that you would get out of a newborn baby that has not learned anything in its life. That's unconditioned response UR. Some examples of unconditioned responses. We're going to come back to this figure a minute from now, when I define unconditioned stimulus. First up is unconditioned response, automatic response. You're at a party. A lot of people are talking. You're engaged in conversation with a friend, not paying attention to who's around you. Unbeknownst to you, there's somebody behind you that's also engaged in conversation with somebody else. They're holding a cigarette, and at one point they accidentally bump into you with their lit cigarette. They burn your arm with that lit cigarette, and the cigarette burn causes your arm to jerk. Your arm jerk was an unconditioned response, something that happens automatically. You didn't have to learn to jerk your arm. You would have done that if you were a newborn baby. You're at the doctor's office. At one point, the doctor shines a light in your eye, and shining a light in your eye causes your pupil to contract. Pupil contraction is a good example of unconditional response. Happens automatically, would happen even with a newborn baby. And in my example, in the dormitory, taking a shower, fear reaction is the unconditional response. When I was scalded with the hot water, automatically caused this fear reaction. You would have seen the same response in a newborn baby that had not learned anything. Here's one of Hatcher's memory tricks. Unconditioned response, unconditioned stimulus. These are terms you don't use every day. How am I supposed to remember what it is? Remember this. The word conditioned essentially means the same thing as learned. Therefore, when you think unconditioned response, think unlearned response. A response you didn't have to learn, something that happens automatically. Unconditioned response is an unlearned response. Well, if you're displaying those responses, it must have been caused by something. What was it that caused your responses? An unconditioned stimulus, which we'll abbreviate US. Definition for unconditioned stimulus: it's the stimulus that automatically elicits the desired response. Elicit just means brings about. Stimulus that automatically brings about the desired response. No training is necessary. You've already been exposed to unconditioned stimulus, the US. Let's just go back to the figure that I showed you a second ago. When you're at the party and somebody made your arm jerk, the cigarette burn was the unconditioned stimulus. It automatically caused the arm to jerk. When you're at the doctor's office and the light made your pupil eye contract, the light shining in your eye was unconditioned stimulus that brought it about. When I was taking the shower, the hot water was the unconditioned stimulus that automatically caused my fear reaction. Now, having heard these scenarios that I've described so far, it's reasonable for you to ask, what does this have to do with learning? Everything you've talked about so far has been basically reflexes. Your arm jerk, that doesn't have anything to do with learning. Your pupil contraction, that's not learning, happens automatically. To understand what this has to do with learning, we come to one of the big names in psychology. Remember back with the first test, I said you didn't need to memorize the names of the people that was presented in the chapter that went over the history of psychology, because I said when the time was right, I would lecture on these names and you would learn their names at that point. Now, here's one of the names that I do want you to know, the name Ivan Pavlov, generally viewed as the father of classical conditioning. Published much of the primary research that's in all the textbooks now, the first one to write about classical conditioning. Ivan Pavlov was an interesting character. He was not a psychologist, he was a physiologist. He did his work in the late 1800s and early 1900s when there were hardly any psychologists around. Very good at what he did. He won the 1904 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. Not a Nobel Prize in Psychology because there is no Nobel Prize in Psychology. He won his Nobel Prize because he did innovative work that allowed him to study something that no one had been able to study scientifically before. Pavlov studied salivary glands in dogs. Salivary glands are the glands that produce saliva, dog slobber. So these are dog slobber glands. He developed a procedure where he could implant a glass fistula in the jaw of a living dog. It would actually collect the dog slobber, and the dog slobber would come out into this tube. Or if you connected this thing to a rubber tube, to a device on the nearby table, he could measure how much the dog was salivating in real time. Here's another photograph of Pavlov with one of his dogs. I don't know if I've said this before, but I guess this would be the good time for me to say it. I do not necessarily approve of a lot of the procedures that you're going to read about in this course. In my opinion, some of the things that psychologists and other researchers have done to animals are morally questionable, and I think Pavlov's work comes under that heading. I'm not going to berate the point, but be aware that just because I'm lecturing about some topic and some research procedure doesn't mean that I necessarily endorse it. Anyhow, let's talk about what Pavlov did. Pavlov originally followed the following procedure. The procedure Pavlov originally followed in studying salivation. It would go like this. Uh, the surgical procedure has been performed on the dog. The dog is recovered from the surgery. They have the dog standing on the table. They have a rubber tube hooked up to the glass fistula in the dog's jaw, so they're measuring how much the dog is salivating. Nothing has happened for the last 30 minutes or so, so the dog is not salivating very much, and they're measuring the saliva, and they can see the dog's not salivating much. A researcher walks down the hallway and enters the room and injects meat powder into the dog's mouth. Enter the room, inject meat powder into the dog's mouth. The dog tastes the meat powder, likes it, and the dog begins salivating. That's the basic procedure. Researcher walks down the room, injects meat powder into the dog's mouth. The dog begins salivating. Now, that was all that Pavlov wanted to happen. But Pavlov found that if he used the same dog for day after day after day, things would start going awry. Things would happen that Pavlov did not want to happen. If he used the same dog day after day after day, the dog would begin salivating too soon. If you use the same dog day after day, after a couple of days, the dog would begin salivating as soon as the researcher entered the room. Well, a dog shouldn't do that. A dog shouldn't salivate just because somebody walks into the room. That doesn't make any sense. And if they kept using the same dog day after day after day, the dog would begin salivating as soon as it heard footsteps in the hallway. It shouldn't be doing that. It's not natural for a dog to salivate just because it hears footsteps in the hallway. If a dog is salivating just because it sees somebody come into the room or because it hears footsteps, it means something else is going on. It's got to mean the dog has learned something. Apparently, the dog has learned that seeing the experimenter is followed by getting that meat powder that he likes. Pavlov was fascinated by this. He switched his entire research program around and started studying classical conditioning instead of just physiology. I am on page 18 now, toward the top of page 18. Following figure illustrates what was happening with Pavlov's dog. This is the same figure that I showed you a little bit earlier, except now we have the stimuli and responses relevant to Pavlov and his dog. Before conditioning is complete, we have site of the experimenter operating as conditioned stimulus. Remember, conditioned stimulus is the thing that initially does not cause any kind of response. And at the beginning, notice I do not have any arrows going from the site of the experimenter to salivation. That tells us site of the experimenter is neutral. The meat powder is operating as the unconditioned stimulus. Meat powder automatically brings about salivation. You do this with any dog, even a dog that hasn't learned anything, that you've never worked with before. You inject meat powder in its mouth, that dog will begin salivating because they're programmed to do so. If Pavlov used the same dog day after day after day, the time would come that you wouldn't need the meat powder to make the dog salivate. The site of the experimenter alone would be enough to produce salivation in the dog. At that point, we change the name of the site of the experimenter. Previously, we called it the conditioned stimulus. Well, we're still calling it the conditioned stimulus, but what it's producing now has a different name. The salivation, before conditioning was complete, The salivation we labeled an unconditioned response, but once conditioning is complete, we relabel salivation a conditioned response. Now, those are terms you've seen before in my figures, but I haven't defined them yet, so let's define my terms. I'm on page 19, at the top of page 19. First up, conditioned stimulus, which we'll abbreviate CS. Conditioned stimulus is a neutral stimulus that does not elicit the desired response until training is completed. See where this appears in the preceding figure. Neutral stimulus does not elicit the desired response until training is completed. What do you mean by that? Sight of the experimenter is conditioned stimulus. At the beginning, before conditioning is complete, it's neutral. Does not produce any salivation. Notice I don't have any arrow going from sight of the experimenter to salivation. But by the end of the training, it is no longer neutral. By the end of the training, it is eliciting salivation. We call it a conditioned stimulus. It's a learned stimulus. Going back to page 19. Lower on page 19, we have definition for conditioned response, which we'll abbreviate CR. Conditioned response is response that occurs upon presentation of the CS after training has been completed. See where this appears in the preceding figure. Conditioned response, response that occurs upon presentation of the CS after training is completed. This is the thing that changes. If a dog is salivating because you put meat powder in its mouth, that's not a conditioned response. Any dog will salivate if you put meat powder in its mouth. However, if a dog salivates because it sees an experimenter, that's unnatural. If a dog's salivating because it sees an experimenter, it must be because learning has taken place, conditioning has taken place. Therefore, we call it conditioned response. Notice the different terms. Before conditioning, we call it unconditioned response. After conditioning is complete, we give it a different name, conditioned response. Relate these terms to my bad dorm plumbing example. This is my same scenario. I'm on page 20. Same scenario where I'm in the shower room, one of the floors of South Hall. I hear a toilet flush. Initially, it doesn't have any effect on me, but the toilet flush after 2 seconds followed by hot water. Hot water causes a fear reaction. Toilet flush is a conditioned stimulus because at first it has no effect, but once conditioning is completed, if that toilet flush has been followed by hot water several days in a row, it will get to the place where it's no longer neutral. After 2 or 3 days, the toilet flush will cause a fear reaction in me. At that point, it's a learned stimulus. I have learned that toilet flush is bad news, and it will bring about a fear reaction, a conditioned response. You shouldn't be afraid just because you hear a toilet flush. If you are afraid, it's because you've learned something. That's why we call it conditioned response. Let's give you a little practice in determining what's what. Practice in identifying stimuli and responses in Hatcher's examples of classical conditioning. I'm going to describe a couple of scenarios to you. It'll be your job to listen to my description of this scenario and decide what is what. In the story that Hatcher just told, what was the unconditioned response? In the story he just told, what was the unconditioned stimulus? What was the conditioned response? What was the conditioned stimulus? Fill in those blanks just so that you remember that unconditioned response, we're going to abbreviate UR. Unconditioned stimulus, we're going to abbreviate US, and so forth. Now, a word of warning, you should expect 1 or 2 multiple choice questions on your next quiz in which I tell you some story and it'll be your job to tell me what was the unconditioned response, what was the unconditioned stimulus, and so forth. And here's my tip for doing this and doing this correctly. In trying to decide what's what, turn back to my definitions and examples for guidance. What definition did Hatcher give you for unconditioned response, and so forth. I will give you a blanked out illustration of the classical conditioning model to look at as I'm telling you my story. And if you want to figure out what's what, my advice is start at the end of the model and then work backward. I will explain what I mean by that. Start at the end and work backward. In my drawing of classical conditioning, that's what I mean by the model. As you're listening to the story, the first thing you should wonder is, what's the unconditioned response in this story? The unconditioned response is going to be some kind of an emotion or some kind of a reflex that's automatic. You would see this response, this emotion, this reflex in any animal or person, including one that had not learned anything. That is the unconditioned response. Then work backward in time. What's the unconditioned stimulus? Unconditioned stimulus is going to be the event that elicits the unconditioned response. Some kind of an event, some kind of thing that would bring about this response in any animal, in any person, including someone that had not learned anything. Then work backward one more step. What was the conditioned stimulus? The conditioned stimulus should be the event that initially was neutral. Initially, it did not bring about the conditioned response, but by the time conditioning was complete, it was no longer neutral. By the time conditioning was complete, it did bring about the response. That will be your conditioned stimulus. Example number 1. An anecdote concerning the minister and the horse in a small village in New England in the 1700s. This is a fictitious story, but it does a good job of illustrating classical conditioning. There's a new minister that comes to a little village in New England in the 1700s. He is a pompous, self-important kind of a guy. And he says, a guy of my importance should not have to take care of his own horse. I want you to nominate a couple of boys from your congregation who'll be responsible for taking care of my horse. And so some of the parents made their 2 boys go out and do this, care for the minister's horse. The boys greatly resented this. They were not being paid for it, so they decided that they were going to play a prank on the minister. Every day, the boys would go out and would feed the horse, groom the horse, would ride the horse for a while to give it some exercise, and then after riding the horse for a while, would yell, "Whoa!" And then 3 seconds after they yelled, "Whoa!" would jab the horse in the rump with a pin. Now, this pinprick would cause a fear reaction in the horse, and so the horse would be afraid, it would take off running, they'd have to hold on for dear life. They go out the next day, they do it again. Groom the horse, feed the horse, take the horse out riding for a while, and after they rode the horse for a while, would yell, "Whoa!" And then 3 seconds after yelling, "Whoa!" jab the horse in the rump with a pin, and the pinprick would cause a fear reaction. They did this for 6 days in a row. On the 7th day, it was time for the minister to ride into the village. So he saddles up his horse, he rides into the village, the whole congregation is there outside the church waiting to greet him on his first morning. He rides up to them, he yells, "Whoa!" And as soon as he yells, "Whoa!" it immediately causes a fear reaction in the horse. The horse bucks, takes off running, dumps the minister in the ditch, and the 2 boys have their revenge on the minister. Now, having heard a story like this on the multiple choice quiz, you should be able to read a description of a story like this and tell me what's what. What was the unconditioned response in this story? What was the unconditioned stimulus? What was the conditioned stimulus, and so forth? My advice, start at the end and work backward. Pause the video for a second and try this out. See if you can dope out what's what. Then you can turn on the video and see what the correct answers are. Yeah, just to keep you honest, look, I even have a figure of my classical conditioning model. Start at the end. What was the unconditioned response? The response you'd see in any horse, including one that never learned anything. Unconditioned stimulus should have been the thing that automatically bring about that response, even in a newborn horse that never learned anything. Conditioned stimulus is the thing that at the beginning was neutral, but by the end of conditioning was no longer neutral. This is the thing that brought about the reaction. So, the answers. Hatcher says, in this scenario, unconditioned response was the fear reaction. Unconditioned stimulus was the pinprick. Now, why does this make sense? Well, pinprick is an unconditioned stimulus that would cause a fear reaction in any horse, including one that hadn't been trained in any way, including one that never learned anything. Automatic stimulus, automatic response. Conditioned stimulus must have been yelling, whoa. Well, how do you know? Because at the beginning it was neutral, didn't cause a fear reaction, but by the time training was complete, yelling whoa was no longer neutral. By the time training was complete, yelling whoa would cause a fear reaction. That's not natural. An animal, a horse, should not be afraid just because you yell whoa. If it is afraid, it's because some mischievous boys in the congregation must have used classical conditioning on your horse. One more example to try this out and make sure that you're comfortable with the terminology of classical conditioning. Situation 2 is going to be from a movie from 1971, A Clockwork Orange. Controversial film directed by Stanley Kubrick. Very violent movie. It's like a lot of things in this class. I don't necessarily recommend it. It's a highly regarded movie, but also very controversial at the time, in part because of what some people would think glorification of violence. Follows a young psychopath named Alex. Alex is the leader of a teenage gang, and the members of the teenage gang they call droogs. Here we have photograph still from the movie in which the guys are about to beat up this drunk that they found in some kind of a passageway. Early in the movie, Alex and his droogs commit all kinds of violence. They get in gang fights with other gangs. They break into a house and commit violent crimes against people in the house. Eventually, Alex gets caught and sent to prison. And that's where classical conditioning comes in. Alex is caught, sent to prison. He desperately wants to get out of prison, and he hears that they've got some kind of experimental program going on where they can use psychological treatment on you and cure you of your criminal tendencies. The psychological treatment, they call it the Ludovico technique in the book and in the movie, but it's basically just classical conditioning. Alex knows there's no way they can cure him of his criminality. He decides, I'll volunteer for it. I'll pretend like I'm better, and they'll release me, and I'll be out in the world again. This is what the technique goes like. Now, first of all, before I go to my next image, somebody comes to Alex's room the morning they're going to begin the training. They give him an injection. And at first, the drug they injected him with does not have any effect on him. The effect will kick in later in the day. So they give him an injection. They take him to what's basically kind of a big theater, seat him in one of the chairs in the theater, strap him down so he can't get out, have his head in a harness so that he's forced to face the screen at the front of the theater. You can't see it in this photo, but they actually have little clips on his eyelids holding his eyes open so that he's forced to watch whatever is on the screen, whether he wants to or not. That's what this guy is doing here. This assistant is dropping artificial tears in his eyes so that his eyes don't dry out. So they've got him strapped in his chair. He's got to watch what's going to happen on the screen. He's getting nervous. What in the world have I volunteered for and gotten into? They start the movie, and Alex is pleased to see that the movie that they show him is the kind of thing he would like to see anyhow. It's films of violence, of people beating each other up, of people stabbing one another. They actually have some films of Nazi atrocities that are taking place. So Alex is enjoying himself. He's loving this movie. Then, after he'd been watching the movies for a while, the drug that they had injected him with earlier, a couple of hours earlier in the day, the drug finally kicks in. The drug is designed to make people feel nauseous. It automatically causes a nausea response in anybody, no matter what's going on. So after he's watching the movies for a while, he starts feeling queasy, and then he starts feeling sick at his stomach, and then really bad. And he tells the people, the scientists, I don't want to do this anymore. I feel sick. But they ignore him. He has to continue watching the films, and he's feeling sick, and he's watching the film. And he said, I'm not kidding, I'm really going to throw up. And they ignore him. And he's watching the violence and he's feeling sick. And he throws up on himself and he feels just wretched. And they do this to him day after day after day. Every day it's the same. Inject him with the drug. It's watching violent films. After a few hours, he starts feeling sick, and so it goes. After a couple of weeks of this, the scientists declare that Alex is now cured. He's no longer capable of being violent. And they have a little demonstration, which they have some government officials in the theater, and Alex is up on the stage. And among other things, they have a guy come out and he insults Alex and he calls him a twit and is insulting toward him. Of course, Alex doesn't take that off anybody. He makes a fist to hit the guy, but as soon as he even thinks about hitting the guy, Alex immediately feels sick and falls to his knees. He's incapable of violence because he feels so sick. Now, what's interesting about today is they have not injected him with the drug today. The response that he's showing today is the learned response that came about through the classical conditioning that they used on him. So, having heard the story, let's go through our little procedure. In the model I'm about to show you, start at the end and work backward. Start at the end and work backward. What was the unconditioned response? What was the unconditioned stimulus? Unconditioned response should be the thing that occurs automatically to anybody, even a newborn baby. Unconditioned stimulus is the thing that would bring about that unconditioned response. Conditioned stimulus should be the thing that at the beginning doesn't bring about the unconditioned response, but by the end of conditioning, it does. Take a minute, think through your answers. You're going to have to do this kind of thing on your quiz. Fill in the blanks, pause the video if need be. I now go to the answers. Here's the way I see it. Unconditioned response was feeling of nausea. Unconditioned stimulus was the drug they gave him. How do you know? Because this is an automatic response. Feeling nauseous is what anybody would do if they were injected with this drug, including a newborn baby that hadn't learned anything. The drug is the thing that automatically brings about the unconditioned response. In this scenario, what was the conditioned stimulus? It was thoughts of violence. At the beginning, just thinking about violence did not make Alex feel sick, but by the time the conditioning was finished, just thinking about violence would cause Alex to feel nauseous. They pronounced him cured of his criminal tendencies and safe to release out into the world. And they did, in fact, release him out into the world. That was not the end of the movie. That's only about 2/3 of the way through the movie. You can rent the movie if you want to see what happens to Alex next. Okay, I've gone over the basics. I have given you a couple of examples of classical conditioning. When we get back together in person in class, I'll refresh your memory on these concepts, and we'll do a small group discussion exercise where you will come up with your own examples of classical conditioning. See you at that class meeting.